Have you ever wondered why King Solomon married over 700 wives and still had 300 concubines? The true reason goes far beyond what most people imagine. The Bible tells us that after Solomon became king, during the 40 years of his reign, Israel lived in peace and prosperity without facing a single war. But how was that possible? Most people assume it was just about pleasure, power, or the excess of a wealthy monarch. But what if I told you there was a calculated political genius behind every single one of those marriages? Today, we're uncovering one of history's most sophisticated diplomatic strategies, a strategy so effective it secured 4 decades of peace for an entire nation surrounded by enemies. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see King Solomon in a completely different light.
To understand Solomon's strategy, we need to understand the dangerous world he inherited. When Solomon took the throne from his father, King David, he didn't just inherit a kingdom. He inherited a long list of enemies. King David was one of history's greatest warriors. He conquered territory after territory, expanding Israel's borders through decades of military campaigns. The Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Arameans, David defeated them all. But here's the thing about military conquest. Every victory creates bitter enemies. Every defeated king remembers. Every conquered nation waits for revenge. So when young Solomon became king, he found himself ruling a nation completely surrounded by hostile forces. Enemies to the north, south, east, and west. Nations that hated Israel and were just waiting for the right moment to strike back. Now, Solomon could have followed in his father's footsteps. He could have continued the endless cycle of warfare, spending his entire reign on battlefields, watching his people die in conflict after conflict. But Solomon was known for his wisdom, not his military prowess. And he realized something crucial. There had to be a better way. What if, instead of fighting these enemies, he could turn them into allies? What if he could create a network of alliances so strong that war became impossible? And that's exactly what he set out to do. In the ancient world, marriage was far more than a personal relationship. It was the most powerful diplomatic weapon a king could wield. Think about it from a practical standpoint. When 2 nations signed a peace treaty, it was just words on parchment, easy to break when circumstances changed. But when you married your children to each other, that created something much more difficult to undo. Let me explain why royal marriages were so effective. First, blood ties. When Solomon married the daughter of a foreign king, any children from that marriage would carry the bloodline of both kingdoms. Suddenly, it's not just about politics anymore. You're talking about family. How do you wage war against a kingdom where your own grandchildren might someday rule? You don't. Second, the hostage factor. Now, nobody called it that officially, but that's essentially what it was. When a king sent his daughter to marry Solomon, she became, in effect, a high-value guarantee of peace. If that king ever attacked Israel, he'd be putting his own daughter's life at risk. What father would do that? Third, emotional investment. Unlike a treaty that some diplomat negotiated, a marriage involved real human relationships. Children were born. Families grew. These personal connections created genuine reasons to maintain peace beyond just strategic calculation. Fourth, economic integration. These marriages didn't happen in isolation. They came with trade agreements, shared resources, cultural exchange. The 2 kingdoms became economically interdependent, which made war even more costly. And here's what made Solomon's approach so brilliant. He didn't just use this strategy once or twice. He systematically married princesses from virtually every significant kingdom and tribe in the region. He wasn't building one alliance. He was constructing an entire web of interconnected relationships that covered the known world. Each marriage was a thread in that web, and the more threads he added, the stronger and more secure the entire structure became. Now, let's look at some of Solomon's most strategically important marriages, because each one served a specific purpose. The Egyptian alliance was the crown jewel of Solomon's diplomatic achievements. He married Pharaoh's daughter, and you need to understand how extraordinary this was. Egypt almost never gave their royal daughters to foreign kings. It simply wasn't done. Egyptian princesses were too valuable, too sacred. The fact that Pharaoh agreed to this marriage tells us something remarkable about how powerful and prestigious Israel had become under Solomon. This single marriage neutralized the greatest military power in the region. Egypt, with its vast armies and enormous wealth, became Israel's ally instead of its threat. No enemy would dare attack Israel from the south, knowing they'd have to face Egypt's wrath. Then we have the marriages to Moabite and Ammonite princesses. These nations had been bitter enemies of Israel for generations. They'd fought brutal wars against King David. Blood had been spilled. Hatred ran deep. But Solomon married their princesses anyway, and suddenly the dynamics changed completely. It's hard to maintain generational hatred when the king of Israel is married to your sister, your daughter, your cousin. When children were born from these marriages, they united both bloodlines. Ancient feuds began to dissolve. The Sidonian marriage opened up the northern trade routes. The Sidonians, we also call them Phoenicians, were the master merchants and seafarers of the ancient world. They controlled crucial trade networks across the Mediterranean. By marrying into Sidonian royalty, Solomon didn't just gain peace, he gained access to their commercial expertise, their ships, their trade connections. Suddenly, Israel could participate in international trade on a level never before possible. He also married Hittite princesses, forming alliances with the powerful kingdoms to the north. Edomite marriages secured the southern desert routes. Each marriage addressed a specific strategic need. When you add it all up, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, Egyptians, and more, you get to those staggering numbers the Bible records: 700 wives and 300 concubines. That wasn't excess, that was comprehensive diplomatic coverage.
So did it work? Did this massive diplomatic undertaking actually achieve what Solomon hoped? The answer is absolutely yes, at least in the short term. The results were nothing short of miraculous. For 40 years, 4 entire decades, Israel experienced virtually uninterrupted peace. No major wars, no invasions, no existential threats to the nation's survival. Do you realize how unprecedented this was? In that region, in that era, 40 years of peace was almost unheard of. Nations were constantly at war. Empires rose and fell through military conquest. But Israel, surrounded by former enemies, lived in peace. And that peace brought prosperity beyond anything Israel had known before. Think about what happens when a nation doesn't have to spend its resources on war. The young men who would have died on battlefields were instead farming, building, trading. The wealth that would have gone to weapons and armies was invested in infrastructure and commerce. The Bible says that during Solomon's reign, silver became as common as stones in Jerusalem. Now that's obviously hyperbole, but it indicates extraordinary wealth. Trade flourished, the economy boomed. Solomon used this time of peace and prosperity to undertake massive building projects. The temple in Jerusalem, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, magnificent palaces, fortified cities, roads, and infrastructure throughout the kingdom. He accumulated knowledge, hosting scholars and wise men from across the known world. His court became a center of learning and culture. Neighboring kings came to witness Israel's prosperity and wisdom. The Queen of Sheba traveled from far away just to see if the reports about Solomon's wealth and wisdom were true. From a purely political and economic standpoint, Solomon's strategy had succeeded beyond measure. He'd transformed Israel from a war-torn nation into a prosperous, peaceful empire. It seemed like the perfect success story.
But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because every strategy, no matter how brilliant, has consequences. And the price Solomon paid for his political success was ultimately catastrophic. The problem wasn't the marriages themselves, the problem was what came with them. You see, each of these foreign princesses brought more than just political alliances. They brought their religions, their gods, their ways of worship. And to keep these alliances strong, Solomon had to accommodate these religious practices. At first, maybe it seemed harmless. Build a small shrine here, allow some worship there, show respect for his wife's beliefs. But over time, something changed. The Bible records that Solomon built high places, temples and altars, for the gods of his foreign wives. Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, Molech, the god of the Ammonites, to whom children were sometimes sacrificed. These weren't just cultural gestures. Solomon himself began to worship these foreign gods. The man who had been blessed with divine wisdom, who had spoken directly with God, who had built the temple as a house for the Lord, this same man was now bowing down to idols? The Bible puts it bluntly. When Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. This is what the biblical writers really care about. The issue isn't polygamy in itself. Many biblical figures had multiple wives. The issue is that these marriages led Solomon away from his faith, from the very relationship with God that had made him wise in the first place. And there's tragic irony here. The law of Moses had specifically warned about this. It said that kings should not accumulate many wives, or his heart will be turned away. It was right there in the law. Solomon knew it, and yet he did it anyway, believing he could manage it, believing his wisdom would protect him. But even the wisest man in the world couldn't escape the consequences. The political ramifications came after Solomon's death. His son Rehoboam inherited the throne, but the kingdom almost immediately split in two. The northern tribes rebelled and formed their own kingdom. That unified, prosperous nation that Solomon had built, it fractured. Those 40 years of peace were followed by centuries of division, conflict, and eventual destruction. The alliances Solomon had forged through marriage didn't outlast him, because ultimately they were based on political convenience, not shared values. When Solomon died, the bonds dissolved.
So, what can we learn from Solomon's story? Because this isn't just ancient history. There are profound lessons here. Lesson number 1, strategic brilliance has its place. Let's give credit where it's due. Solomon's diplomatic strategy was genuinely brilliant. He saw a problem surrounded by enemies and found a creative, non-violent solution. He used intelligence instead of violence, diplomacy instead of warfare. For 40 years, his people lived in peace, in prosperity. Families stayed together. Children grew up without war. Wealth accumulated. Culture flourished. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary. Lesson number 2, short-term success doesn't guarantee long-term sustainability. Solomon's strategy worked magnificently during his lifetime, but it contained the seeds of its own destruction. The compromises he made to maintain those alliances, particularly the religious compromises, undermined the very foundation of his kingdom's identity. What brings immediate results isn't always what's best in the long run. Sometimes the hard path, the one that doesn't compromise core principles, is actually the wiser choice, even if it seems more difficult in the moment. Lesson number 3, wisdom without principle is incomplete. Here's perhaps the most sobering lesson. Solomon was literally the wisest person alive. God had given him supernatural wisdom, and yet he still made catastrophic errors in judgment. Why? Because intelligence alone isn't enough. Wisdom needs to be grounded in something deeper, in values, in principles, in commitments that don't shift with circumstances. Solomon was smart enough to build an empire, but he wasn't strong enough to resist the gradual drift away from his core beliefs. He compromised a little here, a little there, probably telling himself it was necessary, it was strategic, it was worth it for peace. And before he knew it, he'd lost what mattered most. The final lesson? Every choice involves trade-offs. Solomon chose peace and prosperity, and he got them. but the price was spiritual compromise and eventual political collapse. There's no perfect solution that avoids all costs. The question is, what are you willing to pay and what are you unwilling to compromise? Solomon's story is ultimately a tragedy. A brilliant man who achieved incredible success, but lost himself in the process. A wise king who forgot that some things are more important than political stability. It's a reminder that our greatest strengths can become our greatest weaknesses if we're not careful. That success in one area doesn't excuse failure in others. That winning the world means nothing if you lose yourself. So what do you think? Was Solomon's strategy worth it? Would you have done things differently? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this deep dive into biblical history valuable, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got more fascinating stories coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.